Imagine a force so feared, so utterly relentless, that its mere presence could turn the bravest soldier's blood cold. Now, imagine that force, driven by a fanatical ideology, expecting nothing less than a brutal, overwhelming victory. What happens when that unstoppable force, the very embodiment of ruthless efficiency, crashes headfirst into an opponent that, by all accounts, should have been crushed, annihilated, wiped from existence? On March 6, 1945, in a remote, snow-dusted forest in Germany, this wasn't a philosophical riddle. It was a terrifying reality unfolding in real time, a matter of life and death for hundreds of young men. This was the day the legendary 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal guard, forged into a weapon of terrifying precision and brutality, met its unlikely match in the ragged, tenacious, and utterly defiant elements of General George S. Patton's Third Army. The SS, a name that still echoes with dread through the annals of history, arrived with an air of invincibility. They expected another routine slaughter, a swift, merciless victory against what they perceived as an inferior foe. They were confident. They were wrong. This isn't just a story about a battle. It's a testament to the extraordinary capacity of ordinary men from disparate backgrounds, to do truly extraordinary things when everything they cherish, everything they are, is on the line. It's a vivid, brutal, and ultimately inspiring tale that reveals not just the raw savagery of war, but the profound resilience of the human spirit, the ingenuity born of desperation, and the unexpected power of a fighting philosophy built on adaptability and individual initiative. Today, we're not just recounting history. We're diving deep into a confrontation that military historians continue to dissect and study, a clash that proved the American fighting spirit, fueled by democratic ideals and sheer bloody-mindedness, could stand toe-to-toe with and ultimately overcome even the most fanatical, indoctrinated Nazi elite. Because sometimes, when the odds are stacked against you, when you're told you're not supposed to survive, that very notion becomes the catalyst, the spark that ignites a fight for survival, making the impossible possible. To truly appreciate the seismic impact of what transpired in that German forest, we must first confront the daunting shadow cast by the 1st SS Panzer Division. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler was more than just a military unit. It was a cult, a political instrument, and a symbol of Nazi power. Born in 1933 as a mere personal bodyguard detail for Adolf Hitler, it had mutated, by 1945, into something far more sinister, far more lethal, and utterly devoid of conventional morality. These weren't just soldiers in the traditional sense. They were true believers, fanatics handpicked not only for their physical prowess and martial skill, but crucially, for their unwavering, almost pathological loyalty to the Nazi cause and their chilling capacity to inflict devastating casualties without remorse. They were the spearhead of Hitler's vision, the brutal enforcers of his will, and the embodiment of the Third Reich's unyielding aggression. Their reputation preceded them like a chilling wind. By March of 1945, the Leibstandarte had carved a bloody path across Europe, earning a moniker that struck fear into the hearts of Allied commanders across every theater of war. They had been at the vanguard of the blitzkrieg invasions of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, their tanks rolling over resistance, their infantry executing orders with ruthless precision. Just months earlier, in the frigid, snow-choked Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, they had fought with savage, almost inhuman effectiveness, leaving a trail of atrocities, most notably the cold-blooded execution of American prisoners of war at Malmedy. This wasn't merely a fighting unit. It was a psychological weapon, designed to break the will of its enemies through sheer terror and overwhelming force. Their very insignia evoked a primal fear, a recognition of an adversary who fought not just with bullets and steel, but with an unshakable, terrifying conviction in their own racial and ideological superiority. When intelligence reports filtered through Allied lines, indicating the 1st SS was on the move, shifting into position, the message was clear, stark, and universally understood. The units in their path were in for the fight of their lives. This wasn't going to be just another engagement. This was going to be a brutal, no-quarter brawl against an enemy that embraced cruelty as a tactic and fanaticism as a creed. The expectation, based on their horrifying track record, was that any unit caught in the Leibstandarte's path would be annihilated, swallowed whole by the SS war machine. But on this particular March morning, fortune, or perhaps fate, had orchestrated a different kind of encounter. The SS wasn't facing just any Allied unit. They were about to collide with elements of General George S. Patton's legendary Third Army, and specifically, a mixed force of American infantry, armor, and artillery that, while not adorned with the terrifying mystique of the SS, possessed a different kind of strength. A resilience forged in the crucible of continuous combat across the battle-scarred fields of France and deep into the heart of Germany. These weren't fresh-faced recruits or greenhorns learning the ropes of warfare. These were veterans, hard-bitten and weary, who had learned, through bitter experience and fierce determination, how to fight the German war machine on its own terms, and often, how to defeat it. The setting for this epic clash was a series of densely wooded hills, cloaked in the lingering chill of winter, near the unassuming German town of Stattkill. American forces had established defensive positions there, a temporary pause in their relentless advance, awaiting orders for their next offensive thrust. But what they received instead was not a new directive to push forward, but the full, unbridled fury of the SS, crashing down upon them like an unforeseen avalanche. It was a confrontation born of circumstance, a defensive line improvised rather than strategically chosen, that would forever etch itself into the annals of military history. The collision course had actually been set weeks earlier, a consequence of the Third Army's breakneck advance. Patton, a general legendary for his aggressive, often audacious tactics, had been pushing his forces hard, relentlessly driving them forward to maintain momentum as Nazi Germany, bleeding and broken, crumbled around its edges. This relentless forward motion, while strategically brilliant, came with inherent risks. Supply lines were stretched thin. Communication channels were often tenuous, and certain units found themselves in exposed, sometimes isolated, positions along the rapidly shifting front lines. Momentum, as Patton well knew, was a double-edged sword. It could slice through enemy resistance, but it also left vulnerabilities. And on that fateful March 6th, those risks were about to demand a payment in blood, in a small, forgotten patch of German woodland. The American defensive position at Stattkill, it must be emphasized, wasn't chosen for its textbook tactical advantages, its strategic high ground, or its natural choke points. It was simply where they happened to be when the storm broke. A company of infantry from the 94th Division, a unit that had seen its share of brutal fighting, found itself holding a precarious line. They were bolstered by a single, vital platoon of Sherman tanks from the 8th Armored Division, their steel hulls a comforting, if sometimes insufficient, presence against the German behemoths, and supported by a battery of 105mm howitzers, positioned further back, but ready to unleash their thunder. These combined forces found themselves dug into a series of ridgelines that offered decent fields of fire, allowing them to engage the enemy from a distance. However, these same ridges, in their steepness and density, offered tragically limited options for withdrawal or retreat if the situation turned sour. They were, in essence, anchored, tasked with holding the line against an enemy that rarely took prisoners and never retreated. Captain James Morrison, the senior American officer on the scene, carried the crushing weight of command on his shoulders. He had received fragmentary intelligence reports, vague whispers of German armor movements in his general direction. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him or his men for the sheer scale and ferocity of what emerged from the morning mist. The air, already thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, began to vibrate with a distinctive, deep rumble. It was the unmistakable sound of German tank engines, a lower, heavier thrum than their American counterparts, echoing through the silent, watchful forest. Then, the mist began to part, revealing a sight that had spelled doom for countless Allied units across Europe. Angular, menacing silhouettes materialized from the gloom. The formidable Panzer IVs, their 75mm guns poised, the sleeker, more powerful Panther tanks, and, most terrifyingly, the colossal Tiger IIs, their thick armor and devastating 88mm guns capable of obliterating a Sherman tank from a mile away. All bore the distinctive, chilling insignia of the 1st SS. It was a vision of overwhelming force, a mechanized fist designed to smash through any resistance. The American soldiers, watching this nightmare unfold, knew they were staring into the face of a force that had been groomed for conquest, trained for brutality, and seemingly unstoppable. What Captain Morrison and his beleaguered men didn't know, however, was the broader, more desperate context of this SS attack. By March 1945, the war was clearly lost for Nazi Germany. The Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of Allied offensives from the west and the Soviet Union from the east. In a final, desperate gamble, Nazi commanders were throwing their remaining elite units, like the Leibstandarte, into increasingly reckless and suicidal offensives. Their hope, a faint, flickering ember in the gathering darkness of their defeat, was to inflict enough casualties on the Allies, to create enough chaos and disruption, that they might just force some kind of negotiated settlement, however unfavorable. The Leibstandarte had been explicitly ordered to break through the American lines at Stattkill, to penetrate deep into the rear areas, and to sow enough havoc to potentially disrupt Patton's entire operational plan for the final push into Germany. It was a desperate, high-stakes gamble, and the men of the 94th and 8th were the unwitting pawns in this final brutal play. The battle that roared to life and raged without respite for the next 18 hours wasn't just a clash of arms. It was a profound encapsulation of two vastly different philosophies of war, two contrasting approaches to combat, and, ultimately, two opposing societal values. Where the SS relied on an almost fanatical, suicidal courage, backed by what was often technologically superior equipment and a rigidly established tactical doctrine, the Americans brought something harder to quantify, yet equally, if not more, powerful. They brought adaptability. They brought resourcefulness. And crucially, they brought an egalitarian approach to command, a system where good ideas, regardless of their source in the hierarchy, were not just tolerated, but actively encouraged and swiftly implemented. This flexible, bottom-up ingenuity would prove to be the SS's undoing. When the first SS assault ripped through the dawn light, it followed the textbook German pattern, a doctrine honed over years of devastating victories. Concentrated armor, leading the charge, supported by disciplined infantry, designed to punch a hole through defensive lines and then exploit that breakthrough with lightning speed. The Panzer IV tanks, their 75mm guns spitting fire, led the assault, systematically seeking out American positions. Simultaneously, SS Grenadiers, ghost-like in their efficiency, moved through the dense forest, attempting to outflank strong points, their movements coordinated with brutal precision. It was a proven formula, a meticulously crafted symphony of destruction that had worked with terrifying effectiveness from the flat plains of Poland to the very gates of Moscow. The SS expected the American line to crack, to shatter, to flee in disarray, but something entirely unexpected happened. Instead of breaking, instead of retreating in panic under the initial, overwhelming assault, Captain Morrison's mixed force, outnumbered and outgunned, began to fight in ways that utterly defied German expectations. They didn't adhere to predictable patterns. They didn't cower. They adapted. The Sherman tanks, often criticized as inferior to their German counterparts in individual tank-to-tank duels, didn't try to engage in such suicidal contests. That would have been folly. Instead, they transformed. They became mobile fire support platforms, their relatively thinner armor compensated by their agility. They moved constantly, repositioning, dodging, weaving, making themselves incredibly difficult targets for the heavier German guns. Their crews, seasoned and quick-thinking, coordinated meticulously with the infantry, acting as mobile observation posts, identifying targets with precision, and, crucially, directing torrents of artillery fire onto the advancing SS. The American artillery, positioned several miles to the rear, had been a constant, if often unseen, presence throughout the war. But on this day, it became the decisive factor, deployed in ways the SS hadn't anticipated and couldn't counter. Rather than firing predetermined barrages, an older, less flexible tactic, the 105mm batteries were in constant, real-time radio communication with forward observers embedded with the frontline infantry. This meant that targets could be identified, coordinates relayed, and precise fire missions called down within minutes, sometimes seconds. When SS tanks began to concentrate for their next assault, confident in their numbers and armor, they found themselves not under random shelling, but under astonishingly accurate artillery fire that ripped through their formations, forcing them to disperse in disarray. And when they dispersed, when they broke formation and sought cover, the American infantry, armed with potent bazookas and rifle grenades, could engage them piecemeal, turning their supposed advantage into a deadly vulnerability. Perhaps most importantly, the American defense at Statkill demonstrated a principle that would become absolutely central to evolving U.S. military doctrine, a principle that continues to define modern warfare: the overwhelming power of combined arms operations. This wasn't just different units fighting in the same battle. It was different types of units working together seamlessly, synergistically, each element amplifying the effectiveness of the others, rather than fighting as separate, isolated entities. Tank crews weren't just about their tanks. They shared precious ammunition with the infantry when needed. Artillery observers weren't just calling coordinates. They doubled as riflemen when the SS troops got too close for comfort, defending their positions with grim determination. Even cooks and mechanics, the logistical backbone of any army, understood the gravity of the situation, grabbing rifles and joining the firing line when the sheer intensity of the SS attack demanded every available hand. It was a symphony of unified action, a collective refusal to yield. The turning point in this desperate, brutal 18-hour struggle didn't come through a sudden influx of superior firepower or overwhelming numbers. It came, as it so often does in the chaos of battle, through sheer, audacious innovation, born directly from the crucible of desperation. As the SS attack pressed ever closer, their relentless advance threatening to overwhelm the American positions, Sergeant Thomas "Tank" Wilson, a Sherman commander, found himself in a dire predicament. His own vehicle had been disabled by a direct hit from a German gun, its tracks blown apart, leaving it a sitting duck. In that moment of intense pressure, with the enemy closing in, Wilson made a decision that would not only save his unit, but would be studied in military academies for decades to come, a testament to the power of quick thinking and unconventional tactics. Rather than abandon his damaged tank, a logical and self-preserving act given the circumstances, Wilson realized something profound. The Sherman's main gun, its primary offensive weapon, still functioned, even though the vehicle itself was immobilized. He quickly radioed the other American armor, his voice likely strained but clear, issuing a directive that was both simple and revolutionary. He instructed them to form a defensive semicircle around his now stationary Sherman, creating a tightly integrated, mutually supporting defensive perimeter. What Wilson had intuitively created, military tacticians would later coin an armored hedgehog, a formation where damaged, immobile vehicles were transformed from liabilities into stationary gun platforms, their still functioning weapons contributing to the defense, while the remaining mobile units provided protection, targeting information, and flanking fire. This ingenious concept worked precisely because it played directly to American strengths, while simultaneously negating the Germans' perceived advantages. The SS attackers, accustomed to picking off scattered individual targets, suddenly found themselves facing not a fragmented line, but a coordinated, interlocking defensive system where every single element supported every other element. It was a true Gordian knot of steel and firepower, impossible to untangle by their conventional methods. When German tanks attempted to flank the position, thinking they could exploit a weak point, they suddenly exposed themselves to devastating fire from multiple directions, from the stationary Sherman, from the surrounding mobile tanks, and from concealed infantry positions. When, in frustration, they tried to concentrate for a frontal assault, American artillery, guided by vigilant forward observers, turned their assembly areas into killing zones, raining down a terrifying torrent of high explosives. The hedgehog held, a testament to Wilson's quick thinking and the disciplined execution by his men. But the most crucial innovation, the one that truly turned the tide and highlighted the unique character of the American fighting force, emerged not from an officer or a tank commander, but from Private First Class Roberto Martinez. Martinez, a radio operator, was an immigrant from Mexico who had arrived in the United States just 5 years prior, embracing his new home with the same zeal he now applied to its defense. As the SS attack ebbed and flowed, characterized by brief, intense assaults followed by periods of regrouping, Martinez, a keen observer and naturally inquisitive, noticed a predictable rhythm. During one of these lulls, a moment of respite amidst the chaos, he approached Captain Morrison with an audacious, almost unheard-of idea. They could potentially use captured German radio frequencies to monitor SS communications, to listen in on their tactical chatter, and, crucially, anticipate their next moves. The idea was not only audacious, but technically daunting, especially under battle conditions. But Martinez was no ordinary private. Before the war, he had worked as a radio technician, possessing an intricate understanding of both German language and the complex technical aspects of radio communication. He was uniquely qualified, a quiet genius in a foxhole. Despite the immense pressure and the lack of proper equipment, Martinez, with astonishing speed and ingenuity, jury-rigged a system within 2 hours. He scavenged parts, adapted existing equipment, and through sheer force of will and expertise, made it work. For the first time in the battle, the Americans weren't merely reacting to the SS. They were anticipating. They could hear the German commands, the planned movements, the frustrations of the SS commanders. They were listening in on their enemy's thoughts, gaining an invaluable, almost clairvoyant advantage that fundamentally shifted the dynamics of the fight. The stunning success of this improvised defense at Statkill raises profound and enduring questions about the very nature of military effectiveness and the true factors that determine victory in the brutal crucible of combat. The SS had seemingly possessed every advantage that military theorists typically consider decisive: superior numbers in the immediate engagement, often better individual equipment in their tanks, more combat experience in their elite units, and the psychological and tactical initiative that comes from attacking rather than merely defending. Yet, despite this formidable array of strengths, they utterly failed to achieve their objectives against what should have been a vastly inferior force. This outcome doesn't just challenge conventional wisdom about warfare, it shatters it in several vital ways. First, the battle at Statkill stands as a stark, undeniable demonstration that technological superiority, while undeniably important, means surprisingly little if the users of that technology cannot adapt to unexpected circumstances, if their minds are as rigid as the steel of their machines. The German tanks, individually, were superior to the American Shermans in terms of armor and main gun caliber, but the SS crews, for all their vaunted training and fanaticism, had been drilled to fight according to established, highly formalized doctrine. When that doctrine proved inadequate against the unexpected American ingenuity, when the battlefield refused to conform to their preconceived notions, they struggled to improvise effective alternatives. Their strength became their weakness. Their rigid adherence to protocol prevented them from fluidly responding to a fluid situation. They were masters of a specific game, but when the rules changed, they were lost. Second, this battle vividly illustrates the immense importance of what military historians refer to as institutional culture. The deeply ingrained values, practices, and informal norms that dictate how an organization responds to crisis, how it fosters innovation, and how it empowers its members. The American military, with its relatively egalitarian structure compared to the rigidly hierarchical German system, proved to be a decisive factor when survival depended on rapid innovation. Martinez's groundbreaking radio intercept idea, coming from an enlisted man, might never have been implemented or even seriously considered in a more traditional top-down military structure where enlisted personnel were not expected or even permitted to contribute tactical insights. The American system, for all its imperfections, allowed genius to emerge from unexpected places, providing a flexibility that the Germans simply lacked. The SS, despite their fearsome reputation for aggressiveness and individual initiative in combat, were paradoxically constrained by their own fanaticism, by the very ideology that fueled their zeal. Their absolute, unwavering belief in Nazi superiority, in the inherent rightness and invincibility of their cause, made it almost impossible for them to acknowledge that their opponents, whom they had been taught to consider subhuman or inferior, might be capable of genuine tactical innovations, let alone innovations worth adopting or countering. When American tactics, such as the armored hedgehog or the precise artillery coordination, proved undeniably effective, SS commanders often interpreted this not as genuine military competence or ingenuity, but as temporary luck, a fluke, or a mere momentary setback. This ideological blind spot led them to repeat failed attacks, to send more men and tanks down the same bloody paths, rather than pausing, re-evaluating, and developing truly new approaches. Their fanaticism was a powerful engine, but it also functioned as a pair of blinders. Perhaps most significantly, the battle at Statkill powerfully demonstrates how democratic values, often seen as soft or philosophical, in contrast to the brutal realities of war, can translate into profound, unexpected military effectiveness. The American forces fought not just for survival in a desperate moment, but for a vision of a society where individual worth was measured by contribution, by ingenuity, by courage, rather than by rigid ideology or race. This underlying ethos of individual empowerment and collective purpose, deeply ingrained in their societal fabric, imbued them with a flexibility, a resilience, and a creative problem-solving capacity that purely hierarchical, ideologically driven forces often lack. They weren't fighting for a dictator. They were fighting for each other, and for a world where such dictators had no place. That fundamental difference, often overlooked in the calculus of war, provided an unbreakable core. However, amidst the triumph of ingenuity and spirit, we must also acknowledge the brutal, unvarnished realities that even these philosophical differences couldn't erase. The 18-hour battle at Statkill cost both sides heavily in killed and wounded, a grim tally of human suffering. American medical corpsmen, embodying a different code of conduct, worked under relentless fire, bravely attempting to save SS casualties alongside their own men, a remarkable humanitarian gesture that, tragically, was rarely reciprocated. The German wounded, indoctrinated to the core, often refused American medical treatment, preferring to die rather than accept help from enemies they had been systematically taught to consider subhuman, an appalling testament to the psychological grip of Nazi ideology. The cost of victory was always measured in blood, and Statkill was no exception. As the sun, a weary orange orb, finally dipped below the horizon on March 6, 1945, the battered, scarred forest around Statkill fell silent for the first time in 18 grueling hours. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, that once unstoppable force, was withdrawing, their vaunted aura of invincibility shattered. They left behind a grim testament to American defiance. 17 destroyed or abandoned tanks, their steel hulks burning or broken, and over 200 casualties, a heavy toll for an elite unit. The Americans had held their ground. They had achieved the impossible. But this victory came at a cost that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Captain Morrison's mixed force, once a company strong, had been reduced by nearly 60%, a devastating human price for their heroic stand. Yet, despite the immense suffering, they had achieved something that would resonate far beyond that single blood-soaked battlefield. They had definitively proven that American fighting men, when properly led, equipped, and perhaps most importantly, when empowered to think and innovate, could match and defeat the best that Nazi Germany could field. More profoundly, they had demonstrated that the values of individual initiative, adaptability, mutual support, and a decentralized problem-solving ethos, values that defined American society itself, could be decisive factors, even in the most brutal and unforgiving circumstances imaginable. The significance of the battle at Statkill extends far beyond its immediate tactical results. Within weeks, intelligence reports detailing the American defensive innovations observed on that day, the armored hedgehog, the precision artillery, the radio intercepts, were being circulated throughout Allied commands. These insights contributed directly to tactical developments that would prove absolutely crucial in the final, grinding campaigns of the European War. The armored hedgehog concept, pioneered by Sergeant Wilson's quick thinking, became standard doctrine for defensive operations, replicated across battlefields. Private First Class Martinez's audacious radio intercept techniques were adopted and refined by intelligence units across multiple armies, giving Allied forces an invaluable edge in understanding and predicting enemy movements. But perhaps the most enduring an important legacy of that cold March day lies in what it revealed about the fundamental nature of American military effectiveness. The men who fought at Statkill weren't superhuman. They were ordinary citizens, factory workers, farmers, students, immigrants, who had been transformed by rigorous training, brutal experience, and the stark necessity of survival into something truly extraordinary. They succeeded not because they were intrinsically better individual warriors than their SS opponents, who were, in many respects, highly skilled and fanatically brave. They succeeded because they fought as part of a dynamic, adaptable system that valued every person's potential contribution, that rewarded innovative thinking, and that fostered an environment where ingenuity could flourish, even under the most intense pressure. Today, as we navigate a world riddled with new and complex challenges, from geopolitical tensions to global pandemics, from technological shifts to social upheavals, challenges that demand both individual courage and collective coordinated action, the story of Statkill serves as a powerful, timeless reminder. It reminds us that the greatest strength of democratic societies, their most potent weapon in the face of adversity, lies not in their ability to produce perfect leaders or invincible warriors. Rather, it lies in their inherent, organic capacity to unleash the creative potential, the ingenuity, and the unwavering resilience of ordinary people when truly extraordinary circumstances demand it. It's about empowering everyone to contribute, to think, to adapt. The first SS, the so-called unstoppable force, had expected another routine victory against what they considered inferior opponents, an easy crushing of those they deemed less worthy. Instead, they encountered something they simply couldn't understand, couldn't categorize, and ultimately couldn't defeat. They met free men, fighting not for an ideology of hate or the will of a dictator, but for something bigger than themselves, for a vision of humanity, for liberty, and for each other. And critically, these free men possessed the intelligence, the flexibility, and the collective will to adapt their methods to any challenge, to turn disadvantage into opportunity, and to improvise brilliant solutions under the most intense fire. On that cold March day in 1945, by all conventional military wisdom, Patton's men weren't supposed to survive. But they did more than merely survive. They proved that when democracy is challenged by tyranny, the outcome isn't predetermined solely by who has the better equipment, the larger numbers, or the more fanatical soldiers. Sometimes, the outcome is determined by who can think faster, adapt quicker, hold together longer, and innovate more profoundly when everything around them is falling apart. That, truly, is a lesson worth remembering, worth internalizing, and worth carrying forward. Because the world, even today, is still full of those who believe that their cause, their ideology, their supposed superior technology, or their sheer ruthlessness makes them invincible. The silent, scarred forest near Statkill stands as a permanent, undeniable reminder that they are, and always will be, profoundly wrong.